Asian Americans often occupy an unusual and contradictory space in the US, they are sometimes praised in some moments, yet treated as outsiders in others. This tension appears in everyday interactions, public narratives, and national events, and it raises a larger question about how Asian Americans fit into the country's racial structure. Claire Jean Kim's concept of racial triangulation offers a compelling explanation for this dynamic by showing how Asian Americans have been positioned relative to both whiteness and blackness through the process of selective praise and continued exclusion. Building off of this framework, I explore how racial triangulation developed historically, how it continues to shape stereotypes and social expectations, and how it influences the way that Asian Americans experience race today. Drawing from both the class readings and peer reviewed research that I found, I argued that Asian Americans have been placed in a racialized middle space that pressurizes them towards compliance, minimizes their encounters with racism, and reinforces broader racial hierarchies. Understanding these dynamics is essential for making sense of how Asian American identity is constructed and interpreted in present day today. To begin, Claire Jean Kim's article, The Racial Triangulation of Asian Americans, provides the framework and structure that connects everything within this project. Kim argues that Asian Americans have been shaped by two linked processes: relative valorization and civic ostracism. Kim explains that dominant groups have historically praised Asian Americans relative to Black Americans to, quote, in order to dominate both groups, a process she calls relative valorization. At the same time, she also explains that whites have also treated Asian Americans as, quote, immutably foreign and unassimilable, which she identifies as civic ostracism. Together, these forces place Asian Americans in an in between racial position where they're seen as successful or hardworking when it's convenient, but their belonging is always conditional. This theory helped understand how Asian Americans encounter both positive stereotypes but also exclusion at the same exact time, and why this pattern has remained so consistent over so many generations. The long history behind the racial positioning becomes even clearer in another source from this course called From the Chinese Exclusion Act to Now. This reading shows how Asian Americans were marked as foreign and threatening from the earliest that they came to the US. They were blamed for disease outbreaks, economic instability, and cultural disruption, which helped justify exclusion laws and violence towards them. One section of the text explains how Chinese immigrants were portrayed as a public health risk, linking them to disease in ways that they had no scientific basis off of. This stereotype resurfaced repeatedly, including during the COVID pandemic, where the reading also emphasizes that the Asian Americans were consistently viewed as neither black nor white, but somewhere in between, which directly reflects Kim's triangulation model and shows how deeply rooted the racial position is. By connecting these historical patterns to modern events, the reading reinforces that the idea that Asian Americans' racialization has been involved both by praise and exclusion, and that these forces continue to shape public attitudes today. The persistence of these ideas became especially clear in recent research. This peer reviewed article titled From Asian American Triangulation to Recommendations for Solidarity examines how Asian Americans experienced racism during the COVID pandemic. The author points out that anti Asian racism was frequently treated as less urgent and less legitimate when compared to discrimination faced by others. The minimization reflects racial triangulation directly, as Asian Americans faced real violence and harassment, but public discussion often downplayed their experiences because of the ongoing assumption that Asian Americans were resilient, successful, or insulted by from racism. The article argues that the contradiction was not accidental, but built into how Asian Americans have been positioned historically. This study has helped me see how triangulation influences not only interpersonal interactions, but also broader conversations about which forms of racism deserve attention from our nation. The second peer reviewed article that I used is called Reinforcing or Challenging the Status Quo, which focuses on how the model minority myth shapes Asian American activism. One of the key findings is that the model minority stereotype, quote, pressures Asian Americans to remain silent, compliant, and apolitical. This idea connects strongly to Kim's concept of civic ostracism, as when Asian Americans are expected to be quiet or non-confrontational, it becomes harder for them to speak open which openly about discrimination or take part in activism. The author also notes that model minority myth, quote, reinforces racial hierarchies by making Asian Americans appear to succeed without support, which has long been used to undermine their struggles, and to marginalize other groups. This research helped understand how triangulation operates not only from the outside but also internally, shaping how Asian Americans navigate their roles with larger racial dynamics. As I reflected and thought upon all of these sources that I used, I started thinking about how these ideas show up in my own life. While my experiences are not as extreme or some of these examples in these research or articles that used, I've noticed subtle comments or assumptions based on stereotypes about Asians being a little more quiet, being more academically focused, or not being involved in racial issues, as this has come up in my life in different conversations and of what I've overheard walking by someone. These moments used to feel isolated or random, but now I recognize them as part of a much larger historical and social pattern. I also understand more clearly why Asian American experiences are overlooked in conversations about race. Triangulation pushes Asian Americans into a middle space that makes their struggles seem less visible, even when discrimination is continuing to happen every single day. Overall, racial triangulation provides a valuable lens for understanding how Asian Americans have been shaped by historical narratives, social expectations, and political forces. Kim's theory explains how praise and exclusion work together. The historical reading shows where these ideas originated, and the two peer reviewed articles that I used illustrate how deeply they continue to influence contemporary life and everyday life. By examining these connections, I hope to show that Asian Americans' identity cannot be understood without acknowledging the structures that place Asian Americans in this complex middle position. Recognizing these forces is an important step towards understanding how racial hierarchies persist and how they can be challenged. Thank you.